So I suppose there are lots of different time zones signing in tonight.
Yeah, that's true.
That's wonderful. I don't know what I'm doing with this light. No.
There I go, I appear again. I don't understand it. It's fine. I don't know if Andrea's coming.
Andrea is, he said he was. He's, he will be depending on a good connection where he is, but he should join.
Where are you?
In Milano. I've come back to the city for a few days of work. And where are you from? You're in Rome, right, Shara?
I'm in Frank's in New Haven.
And Frank's in New Haven. When are you coming back to Italia? I want to meet you in person.
Oh, we'll do that for sure. No.
Yes. We
As
have.
soon as I can. There we go.
Un prosecco da Shara.
Ah, senz'altro.
Magari.
E
Or actually,
parlando italiano, perché mi piace molto l'idea che
Va bene.
parla perfetto italiano.
Molto gentile.
I have a nice view of Villa Doria Pamphili from my living room, so it'll be
Ah, che
pleasant.
meraviglia.
So I think, let's see if Casey will tell us in the chat when we should start.
I think so, yes, she will, probably.
From Casey, you can start, it says.
Is that what she says? Okay. All righty. And I think I'm on, yes. So good afternoon and welcome to the New York University Alumni Club in Italy. We're hosting this event from Rome, where it's 6:30 in the afternoon, but I'm delighted to see that participants have joined from many places around the world. This virtual platform allows for a much broader gathering, and while we look forward to hosting physical events again at some point, we are eager to continue to reach out to our community in this way. Unfortunately, we are missing the aperitivo and the lively chat that usually accompany our events, but I encourage everybody, depending on the time of day, to pour a glass of wine or cup of coffee as you enjoy this evening. My name is Shara Wasserman, and I'm the leader of the New York University Alumni Club in Italy. And I welcome you today to a conversation with Professor Frank Snowden, moderated by Cristina Gabetti, on the very current topic of the COVID-19 pandemic, presented in collaboration with the Yale and Harvard Alumni Clubs in Italy. I would like to thank the presidents of those clubs, Andrea Mandel Mantelli of Yale and Fabio Filacamo of Harvard, for having joined in. And I extend a big welcome to the alumni of those universities and to all the participants who are with us today. The mission of the alumni clubs is to create a community, to foster connections through social gatherings and educational activities, and to provide a support platform for our alumni. We often collaborate with other alumni clubs in order to enrich our experiences and to explore the many points of contact that we all have here in Italy. Examples include a private evening at the Gagosian Contemporary Art Gallery with the Columbia Club, a talk on cybercrime with the Harvard Club, and the last in-person event before the lockdown, an evening exploring the marvelous world of Roman artisans with the Brown Club. We work hard to ensure that our events are unique, creative, and stimulating, and all this is sustained by the energy of committed volunteers. I take this opportunity to reach out to the New York University alumni community in Italy for any suggestions and help for future events. I'm very pleased to introduce our conversation this evening with Professor Frank Snowden, moderated by Cristina Gabetti. Professor Snowden is a graduate of Harvard and Oxford University. He taught for many years at Cambridge University in England before returning to the US to take his position at Yale University, where he's the Andrew Downey Art Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine. His field of research is modern Italian history, and he has published extensively on such topics as fascism, the fascist revolution in Tuscany, 1919 to 1922, and on disease, the conquest of malaria in Italy, 1900 to 1962, Naples in the time of cholera, 1884 to 1911. These many publications and many years of research on infectious diseases and epidemics, and his most recent book, Epidemics and Society, From the Black Death to the Present, published by Yale University Press in 2019, have placed Professor Snowden at the center of this conversation as a renowned expert and is the point of departure for our conversation today. A great lover of Italy, Professor Snowden has been coming to Rome for many years, as a young man and later as a professional for his research. In fact, he spent a month from January through June in Rome experiencing lockdown. During these months, he has made his voice very clearly heard in over 50 interviews on international platforms, such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, La Repubblica, Der Spiegel, PBS, NPR, 60 Minutes, among many, many, many others. So we're very fortunate and very grateful to hear Professor Snowden's thoughts today. The conversation is moderated by Cristina Gabetti. As an alumna of Yale University, she serves as the vice president of the Yale University Alumni Club in Italy, and she was recently appointed to the Yale University Advisory Board. She's also the proud mom of a recent New York University graduate. Her son, Pietro Martinoni, in his mom's words, is passionate about history. So welcome to Pietro, congratulations. Cristina declares herself a concerned citizen, a journalist, a writer, devoted to research and to the promotion of sustainable development, an author of books on the challenges of sustainable living and on ways to reduce waste in our daily lives. Cristina shares her voice on many public platforms, such as Italian national TV, Corriere della Sera, and other periodicals, where she reaches a large audience. Before I give the floor to Professor Snowden and to Cristina Gabetti, let me briefly explain tonight's format. The conversation will last about 40 minutes, during which time the participants are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A tab. At the end of the talk, we will leave about 20 minutes to give responses to as many of the questions as possible. At this time, I would like to thank Casey McAlpin, Assistant Director of Global Alumni Relations at New York University, for her continued and very valuable support of our events. And now I leave the floor to Professor Snowden and to Cristina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm deeply honored and seize this opportunity as a way to really increase my learning curve and our learning curve on such an important and complex moment. I don't think anyone can help us read it better than Professor Snowden, because he has dedicated 40 years of his life to research the impact of pandemics on societies. And his book, Epidemics and Society, really is an eye-opener in many ways. So Professor, in the introduction, you write, epidemics are not random events. They give warnings, yet we all seemed so unprepared. What were the warnings we should have seen?
Oh, well, first, thank you for your very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be with you here, so thank you for inviting me. With regard to your question, yes, I do believe that one of the oddest features of this pandemic was the way in which the world was caught by surprise. What were the warnings? The warnings began with the 1997 avian flu, after which virologists announced throughout the world that this was an experience that opened up an era in which we were all, as a global community, intensely vulnerable, above all, to pulmonary viruses. And as a consequence, we've experienced almost a quarter of a century of warnings and dress rehearsals for the situation we're in. Warnings such as in a sense, the most surprising question asked so far during this pandemic is the one asked plaintively by President Trump. Who could have known? My answer is, I believe that everyone should have known. In 2005, we have the Congress holding a hearing on pulmonary viral diseases with Anthony Fauci and Julie Gerberding, the head of the CDC, who made an analogy in their testimony. They said that meteorologists can now predict that if you live in the Caribbean, it's an inevitability that a hurricane is in your future, and meteorologists can't tell you the date and the force of the winds, but they know that if you don't prepare, you're going to be clobbered. They said it's exactly the same with virology. Virologists can tell us, they said in 2005, that we're going to have an epidemic challenge that could be worse than the Spanish influenza, or perhaps not. They can't tell you how virulent it will be or the date it will strike, but that it's inevitable that it will strike us. And we would, like the people living in the Caribbean, expecting the hurricane, be extraordinarily unwise not to prepare. After this, we had a series of dress rehearsals. We had the avian flu, then we had SARS, we had MERS, we had Ebola. We've had a whole host of preparatory experiences. After each of these, there's been a sort of flurry of preparedness. Occasionally plans have been drawn up, but the dominant direction of our culture and society has been not to pay close attention to epidemic diseases. And so immediately after each event, the world went about the business of cutting funds for scientific research into diseases, for public health ministries. The funds were cut. We see great challenges across the globe to the authority of medical science, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, Le Pen in France, the Republican Party in the United States, which all have doubts about climate science, and therefore also about the danger of this onset. So the world was systematically unprepared, both in terms of its thinking and in terms of the infrastructure. We defunded in many ways the World Health Organization, which is just the organization that we need to deal with this sort of emergency. The CDC was underfunded, and we've seen what happened with hospitals across Europe and the United States. So I would say we were comprehensively unprepared for this event.
And it seems like we're unprepared for the consequences. I just read the other day that health centers are underfunded as well. And the margins between the physical illness and the mental illness are probably very slim. What is the impact overall? And more than anything, how is COVID-19 really suited for the society we've made?
If I could start with your last question first, I think why is COVID-19 suited for the society that we've made? And this goes back to the question you asked first too, that these epidemics are not random, that I do believe that societies create pathways through that microbes have no agency. We are the ones who create the pathways that microbes exploit. And microbes are infinite in number, and they evolve with extraordinary rapidity, and they take advantage of opportunities as we create. Now, this can be seen, I would call COVID-19 the first great pandemic of the age of globalization. And what I mean by that, in answering your question, is that globalization consists of the following. First of all, enormous population growth. We're now approaching 8 billion people in the world, and that's a fundamental precondition for what's happening now. Another has to do with the environmental issues. That is to say, environmentalism and public health need to go, this is another way in which we weren't prepared. They need to go hand in hand to protect the environment and to ward off epidemic disease. And ways in which that is true, there are two that are absolutely fundamental. One is that we live in a rapacious industrial world that has very little or no respect for the other creatures on the planet. And so we're indulging in rampant deforestation at this very moment. And that means that we're reducing the habitat for wild animals. And in terms of habitat, that means that human beings and wild animals are coming into ever increasing and numerous relationships that they would not have in the past. And so we have what people are now terming spillover, an increasing tendency for microbes that humans had almost never encountered in the past, or never at all, to spill over and that into human populations. And this is critical with regard to bats that are the most numerous mammalian species, and they are at the root of SARS, Ebola, and now COVID-19. That's not by chance. We've created that minimizing biodiversity and destroying habitat, and also hunting and all of the rest that goes with it. Then we talk about globalization. Another aspect is urbanization, and ferocious urbanization that's creating mega cities and very large cities, densely populated. And also another feature of them is they have great air pollution. And it's turned out, recent research has pretty conclusively demonstrated that air pollution both makes people much more vulnerable to COVID-19 and worsens the disease, makes it more likely to be severe if people have it. And this is part of the mystery of why Lombardy and Milan were so badly affected in Italy. Part of the reason that Mumbai and Delhi have been such epicenters, or New York City and Los Angeles. So nitrogen dioxide and ozone are particularly culpable in this way, as is particulate matter. And so those are great vulnerabilities that we have created and haven't controlled. So we could say that these epidemics aren't our destiny. We have created opportunities that they can exploit. Another feature of globalization, of course, is massive movement of people, at millions of people in airplanes, so that a disease that's spread by air, as COVID-19 is, if it breaks out, let's say in Mexico City in the morning, it would be in Rome and New York City and Los Angeles and Jakarta by the evening. So this is another major vulnerability, and we've seen the role that air travel played. And then I think there are cultural attitudes that made us quite vulnerable. The idea that you can have infinite expansion of population and industry on a planet with finite, limited resources, the lack of attention to the other species that live on the planet, the lack of respect for science. And a last feature I would mention of globalization is rampant inequality. Inequality both between global north and global south, and inequality within individual countries. And we see epidemiologically that COVID-19 is ferociously exploiting those channels of inequality and vulnerability. It attacks the weakest members of society in a very systematic way throughout the world. So it's in that sense that I would say that this is not a chance event, not a random event, not an event that hasn't been foreseen for a very long time. Any epidemiologist would have been able to say, if a pulmonary virus spread by the air appears and is easily transmissible, these are the centers that would be most likely to be stricken, where people congregate in large numbers and have pre-existing medical conditions, breathe air with polluted matter and various noxious, toxic chemicals in the air. That's something that was predictable, and we've seen it play out in prisons, in elderly care centers, these sorts of environments. That seems to me a large part of the story of how we got where we are at this moment.
These patterns actually rhyme with a lot of things that you write about in your book. I mean, the first global pandemic, the bubonic plague, seemed to have been zoonotic and therefore passed on by animals. There's been pandemics related to peaks of urbanization. So it seems like, I mean, we had all the information we really needed, yet, as you're saying, it's kind of obvious that Lombardy had a peak, but no one is really embracing that information with a sense of responsibility. They're now saying that it has to be proven, because that's where science in its unfortunate narrative steps in, and you have these long periods of time that are necessary in order to prove that really something has happened in a certain way. So that's where maybe morals come in, or just overall human intelligence. Why are we so slow at acting upon what we know?
Quite some time ago, Joshua Lederberg answered this very question and said that microbes, we live in a world, we share a planet with infinite numbers of microbes. And the microbes have the advantages because of their number and their rapidity of evolution. Human beings evolve at a very slow rate. And that the one advantage people have is their intelligence. And by intelligence in this case, I think we mean the science of public health and science more generally. And secondly, I would add the capacity to collaborate. What we see in this pandemic, that people have not relied on the instruments that we can have to protect us. International collaboration has broken down. We see that in the way that the WHO, the World Health Organization, was badly funded, badly prepared, and lacks the kind of authority to lead the world in its response and direct resources to the places where they're most badly needed. All of that is part of the way in which we weren't prepared to deal with this event. And so you're absolutely right. This is part of the crisis and this lack of respect and trust for science.
I was surprised to read that the WHO published in 2018 a report called World at Risk. Now, how did that pass unnoticed? Why didn't every single leader on this planet act upon that? Does that have to do with, what does that have to do with?
Okay, here we'll speculate a little bit. It seems to me that, well, first, this report was a very, what's even more surprising is that it was a very authoritative report written by some of the leading experts on public health and disease. And they produced, as you said, this strikingly entitled report, A World at Risk, which is saying very clearly that we are going to have this pandemic and we're not prepared for it. Why do people not prepare? I think here's where I would imagine. First is a kind of hubris in the developed world in particular. And that is the idea that, oh, well, we have science. And by that, what I think is meant, we have sanitation and we also have clinical medicine. But clinical medicine is not public health. although it's great to have well-developed clinical medicine, but we've systematically privileged clinical medical science rather than public health science. And that's partly a hubristic idea that we are, in New York, in Rome, in Paris, it's not a single place. It's really a global phenomenon. We don't have to worry anymore. We are wealthy. We have wonderful hospitals. This is something that maybe will affect someplace distant on the globe. It won't clearly affect us. I believe that was an attitude. Another is that there's a great tendency to want to put, this is a human nature, isn't it? To put these worrisome microbes behind us. People don't like to recall death and suffering, and it's much more pleasant to budget funds for economic development, for tourism, building infrastructures of that kind, roads and so forth. And so there was this aspect of it. And then we can also see the weight of neoliberalism as an ideology, stressing that what should happen is that budget should be balanced and social spending should be cut. And so just at a time when during the epidemic, this pandemic in its early phases, Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, was saying that what really needs to happen for preparedness to make public health possible is that every person on the world, in the globe, needs to have access to care. The reason for that being partly humanitarian, but even more than that, it is a counsel of self-interest because we're all in this together. And what happens to the most vulnerable among us will happen to everyone. And so public health is blindfolded if those who are most disadvantaged do not bring their conditions forward to the attention of physicians, because then people can't track where the disease is, they can't do contact tracing, and they simply are blindfolded. And we have, and even the wealthy countries, and the United States is a really good example with so many millions, 30 million people who are outside the healthcare system. This is those attitudes, that lack of access, that propels us forward, as does the failure to build into our health system surge capacity and protocols for dealing. And that brings me lastly to the mental health component, which hasn't been addressed really in any systematic way at all. And what is being revealed by interviews, for example, in the United Kingdom, it's been demonstrated that something like 80% of healthcare workers and physicians reported symptoms of anxiety and depression that people would call post-traumatic stress syndrome, and that people are also, there have been very great spikes in taking antidepressants, also regulated substances, alcohol. We know that domestic violence and child abuse, these are all symptomatic, I believe, of severe mental conditions and stress. And one can just imagine those people who are already rather fragile mentally and already under care, whose care has been taken away during this period. So this is something too that healthcare systems have privileged physical health over mental health. And that may well come to haunt us as one of the great sequelae of this epidemic. And it's now not certain whether COVID-19 has, in fact, a negative impact on cognition, the nervous system, and the brain. And that needs to be recognized as well. And there, for example, just recently in Italy, as you know, there was a study in Rome about this very issue, and 84% of patients who had been severely ill of COVID-19, 2 months later, were still experiencing symptoms. Some of those were shortness of breath and fatigue, but they were also experiencing depression, lack of ability to concentrate or to be productive. So I think we're going to experience mental health conditions, and for those, we were extraordinarily ill-prepared also, and still are.
And emotional health, because you spend some wonderful passages in your book about the rituals of death. Well, those were completely severed as well, because people were not allowed to be close to their loved ones. They left for the hospital. They never even gave them a funeral. Now some are turning to Zoom for memorials, but I mean, that's another big gap in the rituals of our society that have to do with the natural cycles of life. Mm-hmm. So it seems like there's a lot of complexity. And I wonder, what do you feel about the prioritization and the flow of communication? I feel like media went crazy, giving us, you know, a lot of bad news and warnings, but there was no coherent, constructive flow of communication. So maybe we should all have a WHO app on our phones. I don't know. I'm wondering who should be communicating what we all need to know about how to behave.
Right. We have, in fact, I will once again quote Dr. Tedros, who's, I don't want to, you know, make a mythology about Dr. Tedros. He also said some things that are worth questioning, but some very wise things as well. And one of those was that the physical disease, COVID-19, has in its slipstream a second pandemic, which is that of information, misinformation. And he said that that second pandemic is almost as dangerous as the first because it paralyzes the capacity to deal with the first pandemic in a coherent, rational, collective, organized manner. And so it disarms public health for facing the disease. By the misinformation, what did he mean? He meant things such as that it's nothing more than a cold, that it's the same as seasonal flu, that young people can't get it, that it's a disease that's the Chinese flu, or even worse, people calling it the Kung flu, or that it's a disease of immigrants. All of those are terribly serious because what they do, in addition perhaps to being ethically reprehensible, some of them, they actually really mean that resources and attention are misdirected not to deal coherently with the epidemic itself in a rational, coherent way, but instead to pay attention, say, to if you close the borders to immigrants, you're not going to be safer from COVID-19 because microbes simply don't respect national borders. And I'm very hopeful that the Trumpian wall will not be what future generations look back as a way of the great symbol, our metaphor for the era in which we're living. So I'm afraid that there are lots of reasons that this is happening and lots of reasons to think that the misinformation is very dangerous. And let me, if I may, just show the importance of that by a very quick contrast through two situations that I've witnessed quite from close up. The Italian experience of dealing with this COVID-19, which I don't, again, want to say an Italian model. Italy did not do as well as some other countries, but what is striking is the messaging when Conte made the decrees that imposed the lockdown throughout Italy. There was a single message. It was said that this would last. The reasons for it were carefully explained to the population, and people were told honestly, this is the only way that you can preserve your country, your family, yourselves, and it's the only weapon we have is social distancing. We have no vaccine. We have no remedy for the disease, and people really listened. And one of my favorite quotations from the pandemic was that of Il Messaggero, the Rome Daily, which said that in 3,000 years of Italian history, this is the first time that Romans have ever been obedient. So I think that there was a great compliance, not absolutely universal, but very strong level of compliance. And if you contrast that with the United States, on the other hand, which makes a good comparison, the point is that there was, you have a cacophony. And it's like having a symphony with no director. And that is to say that the White House said one thing, White House advisors like Fauci said something else. The 50 different state governments and governors said something else again, all of them different. Mayors of cities said something else. Local departments of health, the CDC. And so there was, it's not surprising that Americans had no idea of what this is, how to confront it, no sense of being part of a unified, coherent national response. And so there was an extraordinary attitudinal problem, which is that people did not comply, and there were corona parties. It became not wearing a mask for large numbers of people was a sign of strength, of fearlessness, of bravado, of loyalty also to the president. So that led to this terrible upsurge that the United States is experiencing at this very moment. So those are two contrasting examples. And I think that without wanting to glorify one or the other, I think it's instructive to look at the lessons we can learn, because we need to draw those lessons in order to establish how we're going to emerge in the next couple of years from this experience, and how we're going to be prepared next time, because I think that the lesson of these last 25 years I've been referring to is that this is not the end. We're going to experience, I'm not saying anything apocalyptic, and I'm not talking about catastrophe. I'm saying that we're going to have epic challenges of pulmonary viruses that we're going to have to deal with, and whether we allow them to be catastrophes or not is our choice. It depends on whether we are going to be prepared and deal with them in a rational and scientific way. And if they're devastating, that's in large part because we've allowed them to be so. If we created pathways, we can also block them off. That's the good news.
And what are the key guidelines to foster, cultivate preparedness?
That's a lengthy list, but let me just begin with a few that seem critical. And I'll quote Bruce Aylward, who led the international mission to China. And when he came back, he's the great Canadian epidemiologist. And he was asked on his return something very like the question you just asked me. And he said, Well, if we're going to be prepared in the future, what we have to do first is to change our hearts and minds. And by that, he meant that we have to have respect for science, and we have to have respect for our international interconnectedness. Internationalism is a crucial part of our survival network, and so we need international organizations. I'm including in that the European Union, which is a very crucial player and could have played a much more constructive part in having a coherent international strategy, which it lacked. And there were many signs of fissures during the European Union's response to this disease. And so the European Union can do a much better job. We can have a World Health Organization that's better funded, and it can do a much better job. And then we need to have, so an attitudinal change is essential. We also need respect for science and a funding for science and for public health. We need to establish health coverage or access to health for everyone in the world. Without that, we don't have a real public health. We have to address the problems of vulnerability, inequality, poverty within our societies. We have to deal to close off by regulating the way that our economy is destroying habitat and deforestation. We have to have a solution to the problem of atmospheric pollution, which is creating lungs in which viruses flourish.
Are you optimistic that you'll see this happen in the near future?
I'll be nasty and say yes and no. What do I mean by that? I'm not optimistic that this will happen in the next year or two, but I am in a qualified way more optimistic, and in part in the longer run, because one of the features of this situation in which we find ourselves is that fallacious, mistaken strategies don't work. They fail, and people come to understand that. And it seems to me that for a time now, we're going to have a situation in which people are really willing, and governments are willing, or will become willing, to listen to what went wrong and why. And I'm hoping voters will insist that they listen. So that's the grounds for my optimism, which is not unqualified by any means. But I think rather than saying I predict that's what will happen, I'd rather say we have the opportunity to make that happen. And the more that we have these conversations thinking about these issues, the more the world puts it, we all put our heads together to talk about what's happened and what to do about it, the more, and to insist that change be made, the more likely we are to be able to do that. And we can see that it's not though just you and I at all talking about this. There are major companies that are talking about a green economy, ones one might not expect, like Shell. There are cities around the world that are trying to reimagine and reconfigure themselves with social distancing being built in. Milan is thinking, as you know, of having boulevards in the center with broad pavements where people can social distance, of having much more attention to cycle lanes so that people won't travel in crowded subway cars so much. That also, it has to do with buildings. with ventilation. And there are many, many initiatives that can be taken. This is the time, in a way, we can also see it as opening at least the possibility for exciting things to happen, because many people realize that they need to. And I think it would be, I could sign on in a heartbeat to reimagining the world in which we live so that it will be safer for our children and grandchildren. And I'll bet that you feel the same.
I absolutely do. I'm going to slip in one last very quick question. It can be a yes or no answer, because then I'd like to open up questions to our wonderful participants. Now, do you think that that COVID-19 is zoonotic? Do you think that there is a possibility that it was created in a lab? And why do you think that Luc Montagnier was hushed so rapidly? Was he really out of his mind when he said that he had proof that it actually was developed in a lab in China?
Right. With all respect to Luc Montagnier and what he did with AIDS, I'm afraid I'm not on board with the idea that this was from a laboratory in China. That seems to me one of those false information dangers that we've been warned against. And there are scientific reasons. Part is that there were many outside people who worked in the lab in China, the Virology Institute of Wuhan, that has been accused, and the safety measures taken were impeccable. There's a consensus about that. And then there's DNA evidence that there's a disjuncture between those microbes on which they were working and the CoV-2, that is the virus that's causing COVID-19. And so it simply isn't plausible. And I also think that this probably, when all is said and done, won't be reducible to a single event. That probably what is happening in what shall I say, the intersection of Vietnam, Laos, China, where there's been a lot of research on the bat population there and numerous bat species that harbor the bats are not affected by coronavirus, which will be an interesting bit of research to see if humans can learn from what bats do. That's another silver lining in the cloud. But it's pretty conclusively demonstrated that there's a straight genetic link between those bats and what human beings are suffering now. And we don't have to think that it happened just one day at a wet market in Wuhan. That may have happened, but there may have been a number of these exchanges, and there are even suggestions it may go back well before early 2020 or late 2019. There may be a longer pathway that needs to be explored and followed. So there may be a number of spillovers rather than one event. And I think that one of the problems with fixating on a conspiracy theory is that it blinds us to the ongoing transmission that's occurring from animals to human beings, and that's what needs to be addressed. Of course, safety measures need to be taken in labs, but that's not sufficient. We need to do something much broader.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. So we have some questions here. One from the president of our Yale Club, Andrea Mandelmantello, who asks, how did past pandemics such as the Spanish flu finally disappear? And how do today's economic consequences, well, actually that's the first one because the second one is the second one. So how did the Spanish flu finally disappear?
That's an excellent question. And one of the things I would say is there are many epidemic mysteries that still need to be explored. and there isn't a definitive answer to why the Spanish influenza disappeared. I think there are many things that one can give as partial answers. One is a seasonality that it followed. And COVID-19, by the way, we can't expect to follow the same path. It's doing very, very well in the hottest places on earth. There isn't going to be a respite because of the change of seasons, but this isn't true of influenza, and COVID-19 definitively is not influenza. And that's an example of how misinformation can mislead people and lead to false hopes and the misdirection of resources to fight the problem that's real. Another feature is that the Spanish influenza affected, it caused perhaps up to 100 million people around the globe to die. And that was with a case fatality rate, a mortality rate of something like of the order of 4%. I mustn't say that. I don't remember at this moment exactly, but let's say that. You can see the extraordinary number of people who were infected. And so we also know that the Spanish influenza is, once you have it, you have a robust immunity, something we don't know about COVID-19 at the moment. And so once the most vulnerable people to Spanish influenza had the influenza, we could say that perhaps it was like fire on wood on a fire, and it ran out of fuel in an easily transmissible way. That's another feature. The end of the war is another factor, and the peacemaking process, that has a whole series of consequences. No longer masses of young men being crowded into trenches and onto transport ships and into camps and so on. That was an important epidemiological feature as well. So I think there are a lot of reasons that the Spanish influenza disappeared. There's no definitive one, but I think all of those working together. But what's interesting about it, and the reason I'm especially glad to have the question, is that it helps direct our attention to COVID-19 as well, which is unlikely. I'm not saying that we won't cause it to disappear one day, but it won't be in the same way that the Spanish influenza disappeared. It's a different kind of disease, and different tools need to be deployed to deal with it.
Are you saying that it's going to last a long time?
I would put it this way. There you're asking me not to be a historian, but to use a crystal ball.
To foresee. Well, your knowledge is such that...
I don't have a magic crystal ball, but more than that, I think I would say that this is a disease that we've known about as a human disease since January only. More is not known about this disease than is known at this moment. And one of the things we don't know is how long it will be with us. And that has a number of possibilities. It is possible. I think it was just today that Anthony Fauci said, well, he expects we may have a vaccine in a matter of months rather than a matter of years, and more optimism there. But I would part company in one sense, which is I don't think we should give people false hopes. There is this idea of magic bullets, and everybody loves a magic bullet. But even I do believe there will be a vaccine. But let's take two facts. One, 30 polls say that 30 to 40% of Americans, for example, would not allow themselves to be vaccinated, such is the strength of the anti-vaccine movement. So what does that mean? And what does it mean also? We don't know first, that the vaccine that will be developed will be safe yet. It's still in an early stage, and we don't know it's going to be efficacious. That there are reasons to think that maybe this not flu, I'm doing it myself, that maybe COVID-19 is not susceptible, does not yield a robust and lasting immunity. And therefore, it may be very difficult to get a vaccine that's really efficacious. And vaccines have been developed against many diseases that have not, as an addition to the smallpox, let's say cholera. There is a vaccine for cholera, but it's always questionable whether it should be deployed or not, because it may be worse than nothing, because it leads people to think that they're invulnerable where they're not, because the vaccine is only about 30% efficacious. Now, I have no way of knowing whether the COVID-19 vaccine is going to be more like the smallpox vaccine or more like the cholera one. I'm a little pessimistic and lean towards the second, but that I don't know. I'm not a virologist. But let us say, I think that we should be wary of anyone who says they know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but it seems likely to me that we're going to have to live with this COVID-19 for a period of years at least.
Andrea also asks, how do today's economics consequences compare to those of past pandemics, and what lesson can we learn from them?
Right. One thing I'd like to say is that there isn't an easy magical response to the question, what do pandemics do? That pandemics each has its own personality, its own biology, and the links that we have created. And so the way in which they play out is different in each case. Many pandemics, however, have had profound effects upon the economy. The Bubonic Plague is a clear example. It killed half the population of Europe. It brought agricultural production and production as a whole to devastatingly low levels in the short term. And then in the longer term, though, it raised living standards. As you could imagine, there were few people left, and it played an important role in the demise of feudalism and didn't create the coming of industry or the Renaissance, but played a background role as a factor that made it possible. We could say the Spanish influenza is at a different part of the spectrum, which is to say, if you read government reports in the 20s and 30s, they hardly mention the Spanish influenza as a factor. And if you look there were very few writings about it and very little to commemorate it. And it really passed quickly through communities, and then people put it aside because it didn't lay siege for long periods. And also there was censorship because of the war. And in addition, there were other overarching things people were concerned with, the war itself and the peacemaking, the Russian revolutions and the Red Scare that followed in their wake. And the leading study of the Spanish influenza in the United States calls it America's forgotten pandemic. And I think that's a very good way of thinking about it, if we want to remember this major cataclysmic event that, ironically enough, left a relatively small trace. Now, I would imagine that COVID-19 is it's not like the bubonic plague. I don't want to say that. That creates an Armageddon sort of thing. And stoking the fears is the last thing I want to do. What I'm trying to say is simply that it's like those pandemics that have created large change because we've seen that it already has done that. We don't have to just imagine it. It, as one journalist said, it put the whole world economy into an induced coma.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know it's having large scale effects. We know part of the reason for that has to do with its ease of transmission, with the fact there isn't a vaccine or a therapy at the moment, the fact that unlike the Spanish influenza, it besieges communities and the whole world for months and even more at a time. And so it was an outside invader. It also was, so we're very susceptible and vulnerable to it, and it's making its way through these pathways we've created. And I expect therefore that the amount of change will be quite large scale as a result, which is not to say that it's going to be the end of the world. It quite clearly isn't.
Well, I mean, there's so much, as you say, to be learned, to put it on a positive note, and it seems that we're also at a fascinating time in history. So hopefully we'll be able to harness all that intelligence. Now we have a question from Frank Fleck, who asks, what do you think of how Sweden went about dealing with COVID with its lack of a countrywide lockdown?
I think my response would be that Sweden seems to have made a big mistake. And the result can be seen in the way there was this surge in cases and the devastation that ran through nursing homes in Sweden. Was a terrible thing. And I think, in fact, that the advisors to the Swedish government have had a rethought. And their strategy was not the same as there's some misconceptions. There are people who think that it was like Boris Johnson's idea of a herd immunity. The advisors to the government in Sweden maintained that that wasn't their idea, that a herd immunity, if everyone gets sick, there will be enormous immunity in the population, which is a leap of faith, by the way, and it seems not to be true. So it was that strategy was a miscalculation. The Swedish strategy, though, was we'll inform people and people can make their own choices. We'll encourage people to social distance, but we won't compel them. And that seems to have been inadequate for coping with this kind of disease. So I would say the Swedish strategy, although there are many people in the United States who thought this was a wonderful thing, a libertarian way of dealing with the disease, it proved not to be effective.
Well, at least though it was outspoken, because as you're saying, the United States seemed to be wanting the libertarian approach, but then it all gets quite confusing because there's such a cacophony of messages coming through. So at least it was coherent and outspoken, yes. Right?
You're right.
So we have another question. How can we expect our habits to change as a result of this COVID-19 experience?
Okay, here we go. Again, in my crystal ball, what I would see is that it will have a lot of effects upon daily life. I imagine that the handshake is going to be a thing of the past, and maybe at best. I think we will be social distancing for quite a while. I think that public spaces will be reconfigured. Our way of working is likely to be transformed. There'll be much more work from home. The design of workplaces will probably be reconfigured. The open plan workspace will be a thing of the past as well. I think the ventilation in workplaces will be completely configured, and there'll be humidifiers everywhere because viruses don't thrive in recycled cool air that's well humidified. So I think those will be practices. I think that the way we go about our entertainments, restaurants will be, I think, something that will be reconfigured. Tourism will be very different. Travel will have a very different feel, and that will have to be dealt with. I don't think you'll see the crowded underground railroad cars that were I think those will be a thing of the past. I think that there will be testing will be around for some time, and those thermometer checks
awesome.
will be part of our daily life as well. So I think on small and big ways, a lot of telemedicine, I think, will be practiced. So I think there's going to be very large-scale transformations, and I think the hospital experience will be rethought, reconfigured, and I do believe there'll be a lot more attention to the mental health aspect of diseases. Those are things that I think will be changed. Religion will be affected, and in countries where there is a great deal of religious attendance, the United States being one, I think there'll be that will have to be rethought. We've just seen in this very morning's news that a Baptist conference in Alabama led to a great local upsurge because they didn't practice social distancing. And the virus, I'm afraid one can't persuade it away or pray it away or wish it away. It's a physical reality and has to be dealt with in physical terms.
Wow, thank you. Okay, we have one from Kate who asks, who or what are the best sources of accurate information going forward? Which could also tie into maybe, why don't we bring in the fact that you are part of a think tank at the WHO, and I think they're very fortunate to have you. Now, what do you see happening there, and do you how do you feel that your contribution can maybe make a difference? And is the WHO again a possible stream of credible, trustworthy information?
There we go. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one that's troubling in many ways. We need such credible information, and one of the features of this pandemic is from the beginning in China to this very morning, we see that there are efforts in play in many, many places to create a favorable narrative out of the disease by misconstruing and also misinforming people as to the nature of the disease, or indeed by not having homogeneous data, so that it's very difficult to impossible to compare one state with another because what the figures mean varies so much. Or one state, like China, changes the basis of its data midstream. So I think accurate information is difficult to come by. I think I would say that the WHO did a middling job in this pandemic. What is notable, perhaps, though, is that it collected figures that were often misleading and aggregated them, but it did not, I believe, add its own falsifications to the data. And so the WHO data, and the WHO admits that its data is faulty, that some of it can't be, underestimates, if anything, this nature and expansiveness of the epidemic. I think that we need the whole issue of more accurate, coherent data, allowing epidemiologists to compare one place with another and to understand what's actually happening on the ground so that steps can be taken to address that. I think that's critical for our future, and we're not there yet to getting reliable, homogeneous, and accurate information. At the moment, WHO information is, it gives some indication of reality, but I don't believe that the figures there are, what eventually will be known about the disease. So should we look to the WHO? Well, I would not say that we can rely for this epidemic at the moment. Hopefully in the future, that's exactly what we need. That's one of the roles we look to see the WHO being able to fulfill, but they need to work with what they call their stakeholders, with national ministries of health. The WHO on its own cannot possibly do that. And then you ask, am I a factor? No, I say that I'm not. I'm barely numerate, and I'm not, I don't collect or statistics, and I'm not able to, manage them nearly as well as one would wish. So no, definitely not me. But I do believe it is possible. Data are critical. We need to have them. And I'm glad of the question because it points out something that's really critical and vital. And let's hope the WHO can fulfill that role of providing international figures. And it needs, though, the resources to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think we have to close, sadly, because I could go on for hours. Now, your book really does explore the intersection of so many areas of knowledge, but that's the only way to really have a full comprehensive view. So we didn't discuss, for example, how pandemics affect the arts, how the arts will survive in our day, from the physical, real experience to the digital experience. What are we gaining and what are we losing? So many other open-ended questions, an invitation to all the participants to read your book because it is enlightening, and to train ourselves to think interconnectedly and in an interdisciplinary way, because it seems like it's the only way to come close to an attitude that mimics the reality that we live in, that is highly interconnected. Thank you very, very much for inspiring us. Thank you, Shara, for having us, and thank you, Andrea, and all the participants.
Let me thank you for all of the questions and everyone for a marvelous occasion. So thank you and stay well.
A presto. You too. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.